All right, so here's our next lesson in the EMT course, motor vehicle crash patients. Very common call. We run a whole bunch of motor vehicle crashes. Some are serious, some not so much. So we wanted to address the type of call specifically and then talk about the specific patients a little bit more. It's a pretty short online piece of this, and then we do most of it in lab. We're going to talk about possible injuries, assessment and management of those injuries, and then we also want to include in this patients that are struck by vehicles. We tend to think of a motor vehicle crash as two different cars or two or more cars crashing, but this is where pedestrian struck also falls in. So safety, safety, safety. Safety is an ongoing hazard assessment. You don't just walk up and say the scene is safe enough to enter and then that's it. Things change. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of multiple agencies. People driving by car crashes don't slow down, it doesn't seem like, and they stare at the crash instead of worry about driving their car. So traffic is always a huge problem. Maybe on a 2-lane blacktop where we have traffic stopped or we're down to 1 lane, that's one thing. The interstate's a whole different game. And then everybody's a safety officer. You know, in ICS we talk about assigning a safety officer, but in this case, even if we do assign a safety officer, everybody needs to watch out for each other. Slip hazards, trip hazards, traffic, sharp objects, all kinds of things. One of the most important things is make sure the cars are in park. Remember, they're driving when they crash, and so they can still roll. So put them in park, take the keys out, put them on the floorboard or the console or something. Don't take the keys, but get them out of the car so it can't start up again. Make sure those cars are stable, and then make sure you're aware of the airbags as well. So airbags are not disarmed simply by disconnecting the battery. It takes sometimes just a few seconds, but in many cases several minutes, maybe up to 20 minutes before that airbag is disarmed, and those can activate, and they come out at such incredible speed that they can injure us as we're working. Flash fire is always an issue. Very rare that this occurs, but it's always possible. And if we're doing extrication, there's going to be a charged line on the ground with someone there ready to put out fire and save the folks that are in the vehicle. And so if that's not happening in the system where you work and you're asked to be in the car and there's extrication going on where you can't immediately get yourself out, you should insist that a charged line be on the ground. And have it on the ground laying there with no one on it doesn't help. It needs to be ready to go, wide fog, ready to go, and ready to push fire off of people. And that means the guy on that line needs to be able to be on air very rapidly. So it's one of those things that we've implemented around here in recent years, and we think it makes a huge difference. All kinds of sharp things, broken glass, bent metal. And then when you tend to get involved in these calls, everybody is trying to remove the patient, and you're almost never in a good lifting position. So try to avoid twisting, try to get plenty of help, communicate, watch out for each other, constantly worrying about back injuries and things like that. Then there's the other stuff, weird things like power lines that are down or a car sitting on an electrical ground box. People carry strange animals and upset animals in their cars, mobile meth labs in the trunk, all kinds of weird stuff. So just be constantly aware. And then, of course, we could do a whole different class, and we do a whole different class on hazmat. But remember that vehicles can be hauling large quantities of hazardous materials and not necessarily have a placard. So that may not be intuitive if you aren't familiar with hazmat stuff yet. You look at an 18-wheeler trailer and it has no placard on it. That doesn't mean that there's no hazmats in there. So we're not going to do an MCI class right now, but multiple patients are pretty common in motor vehicle crashes. Even in a single vehicle, and certainly when you have multiple vehicles, you by definition have multiple patients potentially. And so what you want to do is just start where you stand, but you've got to see all the patients. You've got to start assessing that first patient and then make sure you've seen them all. Generally, drivers are more injured than passengers, and certainly anybody ejected from a vehicle is at significant risk. You're 25 times, not 25%, 25 times more likely to die if you're ejected from a vehicle. And then people also get out of the car and wander around, and bystanders get them out, and sometimes it's not altogether clear how many patients are involved. And try to avoid getting sucked into the scene to where you're only dealing with what's in front of you, and we're not managing the scene overall in terms of finding all the patients. Look for car seats. I have a car seat in my car, and it's rarely occupied, but someone should ask, is the child with you or not? And if the patient can't answer, then we need to do a reasonable search to make sure that a child wasn't removed or escaped on their own. And there's lots of horror stories of finding a child, finding another patient, as we're picking up and cleaning up. So try to avoid that if at all possible. Some injuries that might happen, well, gee, it could be anything, could be everything. It can be anything from minor cuts and scrapes and burns from the airbags all the way to, critical thoracic and abdominal trauma. And so, it's also important to remember that this could be a medical issue that caused the crash, could be a medical issue that's resulted since the crash. And the National Registry world of either it's a medical scenario or a trauma scenario, that's not really in the real world. So medical issues and trauma issues can be mixed. Wanted to say something briefly about airbags and seatbelts. They're wonderful. They save lives. They also can cause some injuries. Seatbelt abrasions, seatbelt bruises. And very frequently when the airbag deploys, there'll be an abrasion, a minor burn. It's irritating, not a big deal, but just be aware of that as well. And then, if you're trying to figure out how hurt someone might be or where the sickest patient is in your crash, look for where most of the metal's moved. In order to move metal, tremendous energy has to be applied, and so that energy has to be transmitted somewhere, and in many cases it impacts the patients. Our assessment for motor vehicle crash patients is no different than any other patient. We still check, is it a code? We do CVO, then we do a rapid versus a focused, depending on whether we see things in CVO. And, try not to be distracted by a dramatic but minor injury, a mangled tib fib, or a large laceration on the head that's not bleeding very much. They're very dramatic, but they're not life-threatening, and they can distract you from finding things in the chest and belly that are a big deal. And then also, sometimes your patient that is screaming and hollering is not the sickest patient. Sometimes the quiet ones, many times the quiet ones are sicker than the loud ones. And so, screaming is a good thing. It tells us about airway being open. It tells us about breathing being adequate at the time. It's the quiet ones that you really want to keep an eye out for. How do we manage injuries? Well, we've done some work on that so far in the labs in terms of isolated injuries and how to splint them and how to bandage them. And in a motor vehicle crash, you have to decide whether you want to do that right there in the car, or you want to do it in the ambulance, or you want to do it on the way to the hospital. And so the big deal is find all the bleeding, find all the critical injuries, try not to get distracted by things that are dramatic but not a big deal. And then, choose the most appropriate splint. The sicker the patient, the simpler the splint needs to be. And in some cases, a long backboard is still the best splint for most of the injuries in the very sick patient. So even though there's been a reduction in the use of backboards for spinal motion restriction, that doesn't mean you can't use them for splinting. And so don't blow off that backboard as a possible good splint for lots of things. A little bit about extrication. Certainly the recruits at least and other fire folks have some extrication background, but everybody needs to know a little bit about extrication. And so here's the quick and dirty on extrication. You may have very simple access, you may have very difficult access. It would be great if you as the patient care provider had an idea about time factors and tactics and how long your patient's going to be entrapped. That also has to do with the tools as well as the techniques and the skill level of the rescue team. But a big overall thing I wanted to talk about was that the patient care leader, which would be you if you're taking care of that patient, whether you're actually in the car or whether you're outside the car, but are responsible for patient care, you're the one deciding who needs to come out first. And so the rescue team leader are taught to check on that, but it's really your decision, and it's your responsibility to communicate who your priority patients are, in what order you need them out, and communicate and work with the rescue team to make sure that we're working on the priority patient. Quick summary: safety, safety, safety. Can't say it enough times. Ongoing situational awareness. Things change. Things change. Multiple moving parts, lots of things going on, and this is not a very orderly scene in many cases, and so that can lead to safety problems. Find your sickest patient first and find them fast, and then find all the critical injuries on all the patients. And let's make sure that we're not working on someone who is not the sickest while we ignore the quieter, less obvious patient that has something real going on in their head, neck, chest, belly, pelvis, or femurs. So make a plan on what you want to do in the car, what you want to do in the ambulance, and what you want to do on the way, and then communicate that. So making a plan is the first step, but don't keep it secret. Be pretty vocal. Make sure everybody understands the plan. And then give some thought to what patient care we're going to be able to do when the patient is still entrapped. Make the decision about whether you're going to be able to get in there because you have adequate protection and there's adequate safety lines and things down for you, or not, in which case you may have to direct patient care or do what you can from outside the car. When this transitions to the ALS standpoint, sometimes IVs and pain control are appropriate in the car, sometimes not. But really, mostly we're looking at some basic management and consider what you're going to do with that. So we'll play with some of that in lab with our extrication car prop as well as some of your vehicles, and we'll get you through some of the thinking and decision making that comes into dealing with patients in motor vehicle crashes. So we'll see you in lab.